Today I'm talking about content delivery network and also a twist with how we host APIs. But first, what is this content delivery network? Before we dive into that, let's start out with a concept called reverse proxies. So the idea with a reverse proxy is that you put this server in front of your real server, and then when a request comes in, the client says get/food.html. The proxy just forwards it to the origin. The origin returns a cache control header that says this is public, it has a max age and some other parameters. Then the proxy will store this response in its own data store and return it to the client. Because then the next time somebody says get food, the reverse proxy can look up it from local storage and just return it immediately. That's, of course, that alleviates the origin for some work. But if you take these reverse proxies and scatter them around the globe, you get the benefit of somebody in South America. He doesn't have to talk to a server in the NAM to download a large vendor JS bundle or whatever other large files there are. He can just talk to the local CDN server and get the files faster and quicker. For us in Europe and NAM, it's not that big a deal. If you are in Australia, it's a big deal because their network connectivity is really slow. When you see stats, at a previous job, we had some stats on how fast our site loaded from different parts of the world. And we were hosting in NAM back then, but Australia was by far the slowest one. And it was orders of magnitude slower than what we were getting in Europe. This is important. Several CDN providers. I've used Cloudflare and CDN previously in a previous job. Here at TrackUnit, we use Amazon CloudFront. They all give the same functionality. Some provide extra features. Cloudflare, they tend to bundle up a lot of stuff in their offer, whereas Amazon, for example, is more like Lego blocks. You get the CDN, the raw CDN, and then if you want the web application firewall, it's another product that you together with it. You get everything in one package. Some of the benefits, already touched about it. If you're serving files closer to your client, it's much quicker for them, especially if they have a crappy internet provider. They might have a bad cell connection, whatever. When the server is close to the client, it gets the data there quicker. It also gives you less outgoing traffic from the origin because you don't have to repeatedly send the same file to Australia every time somebody in Australia wants to load your site. It gives less load on your origin as well. So that is, if you are doing a single page application, that's maybe not the biggest problem. Then you're just serving up static files. But if you're doing like a news site with lots of visitors and dynamic content, then it can give some benefits. And it also has the potential to protect against distributed denial of service attacks. I've remember Cloudflare, they said that they mitigated one that earlier this year. And that when you search for it, there's just numerous cases where the CDN was like the first defense against the denial of service attacks. Some important cache control values. So I mentioned that the origin server returns these headers. It's not the only way to control the CDN behavior, but at least in my experience, it's the easiest one to deal with because it's your own server. You control the code there, so you can control what it does. First, there's private and public. You wouldn't return both of them. So public means that anyone can cache this content, whereas private is that any intermediary, so for example, a reverse proxy, is not allowed to cache it, but when it gets to your laptop, your browser can still decide to cache it. And that really depends on the content you have on your page. If you want to leverage the CDN, of course, you should return public. Then a no store and no cache. And I don't like the naming of no cache, but so no store means, of course, you don't store it at all. You don't store it locally, you don't store it on any intermediary proxies. No cache is a little bit different because you can actually still store it, but you have to validate if it's still fresh and if it's still the same data. So if we just jump in to the code, we can just have a look. So if I just do a curl for one of our resources, we can see here that it says X cache hit from CloudFront. It returns 200. And it also returns this E tag. And the E tag is any kind of value that Origin says this is the hash of the content, or you could do anything. It could be a version number or something else you feel like. But basically, it's a value that if you send it again, if you do the request now, and then we pass this E tag back to the server, notice here that it's downloaded a couple of megabytes. Now we say the same request, but now we get a 304, not modified, and no data was sent. So in this case, if we were using no cache, you could still avoid downloading several megabytes on your client. If you were on a self connection, that would be nice. X8 says how long you're allowed to keep this data. And finally, immutable is a way for you to say that this data does not change. And that is really important if you have resources that you have some naming scheme. And instead of with index.html, the browser will always request the index.html. So you need to have it check every time, is this still up to date? So for index.html, you return no cache because it can still store the content. And then if it didn't change, you'll just get a 304 back and the browser will load it from cache. But if you have, for example, a large JavaScript file, and then you can put in a version number, hash, something in the file name, and then you can say, hey, this is, first of all, public. Anyone can cache it. It has a very long max age. This is, I believe, 1 year. And finally, you say that it's immutable. So everyone downstream, they know that this will never change on this URL. There might come a different URL because you release a new version and it will have a new version number or hash up here. But yeah, it's a way to, instead of asking all the different reverse proxies around the world to flush their cache, you can just give it a new URL and then they will all get the latest version. Oh, I actually had a drawing on the E tag thing already presented, but yeah, you pass along the E tag. The reverse proxy may go to the origin, but the reverse proxy might also still have a recent version because another client requested it, and then it can just return 3 or 4 if it didn't change. Some of the CDNs are also starting to provide more advanced functionalities. For example, this is an example of the Shopify CDN. They allow you to resize images. So if you have an image, a large image of something, and you can ship it basically one time to Australia, and then locally they'll resize it to fit a mobile phone or a large screen or whatever you need in the front end. Cloudflare, they take it even more extreme, that you can basically deploy code on their edge nodes to get really good performance. Yes, then let's talk a bit about APIs, because if you just put all your static content on the CDN, and then you start calling your APIs, you're going to hit the cross-origin resource sharing issues. So cross-origin resource sharing is basically that if some client on my super CDN wants to call myapi.com, it wants to do a post to some path here, then the browser will, before that, do what it's called a pre-flight check. And it's basic security measure, because if it just allowed any malicious site to call any URL, it might steal your credentials and call this URL on your behalf. It will call the user management system and delete all the users because apparently you had access to that, but the malicious site will just use you as a proxy. What the browser will do, it'll do an options request and say, hey, I'm about to do a post. Maybe I have some special headers. Maybe it's extract unit header, something. And the origin is my super CDN. Then the origin can say, hey, I trust my super CDN. So I return that, hey, that's okay, 204. And you're allowed to use this header, and you're allowed to use these methods, and you can cache it for this long. And then you do the post. That's an extra round trip. If you are, again, in Australia and trying to hit a server in NAM, then it takes a while for this round trip. What you can do is route it through your reverse proxy instead. You send a request again. You go to and says cache control no store because it's an API call. You don't want it cached. You want the latest. And it just returns it. So the reverse proxy simply becomes an intermediary router. Some of the benefits is that you don't have to deal with cross-origin resource sharing. So configuring less configuration. And sometimes you also get faster response time. The CDN providers are typically rather well connected on the internet, and they do a lot of stuff to optimize their routing. So where you have tunnels and smart routing techniques, and probably most importantly, that they can maintain persistent connections. If a mobile phone connects and then 2 minutes later, somebody else connects to the CDN, they still have a connection open to your site, so they can quickly send it. Some of the challenges, you're doing SSL termination at the CDN provider, because how are they going to know what's in the traffic? They need to encrypt the connection there and then look at the request. So you can get into issues with GDPR. Basically, if confidentiality is important, you don't route your API calls through the CDN unless you feel that you can trust it. But there are all these cases where, okay, can I then route my data through a CDN which isn't in the EU, and all kind of issues. Lots of these CDN also have configuration parameters where you can say that I only want to use points of presence within the EU, for example, or within a certain country. But it's a hassle. And of course, it is a new attack vector, because if the CDN gets hacked, they may inject something in the traffic that can impact your security. Yes, that was it.